Some families along the coastal low country have told the same story for generations. We don't rightly know the exact shores our people came from, but Grandma always said there was a Cherokee chief or a proud Native American princess in the bloodline. It gets repeated at every holiday dinner, passed down like an absolute truth. And then someone finally spits in a tube, mails it off to a lab, and waits. The results come back. No native ancestry at all. Instead, the map lights up thousands of miles away, over the dense tropical forests of Sierra Leone, the ancient kingdoms of the Windward Coast, or the fierce river networks of the Angola region. The family story was wrong. But here is the part that should make you sit up. The real story was never hidden. It was sitting in plain sight the entire time, printed on every birth certificate, carved on every weathered headstone in the Sea Island cemetery plots. It was the last name. Today we are counting down 12 Gullah Geechee surnames with documented genetic history behind them. Names that trace back to specific African kingdoms, to rice cultivators who built an entire economy, to warriors who survived the Middle Passage and encoded their identity into the surnames forced upon them. A surname alone is not definitive proof of everything, but if yours is on this list, your true clan may not be the one you were told. Count how many you recognise. Number 12. Singleton. We start with a name that sounds like a standard piece of the English countryside. Singleton. Say it, and most people think of a colonial land grant, an administrative label from a London registry. What almost nobody thinks of is the Mende people of Sierra Leone. The Windward Coast, which supplied 16.3% of Charleston's total arrivals, was the primary source for the rice belt plantations of the Waccamaw Neck, where the Singleton name clusters in the oldest records. The Mende carried a tradition of single lineage kinship bonds, a tight clan structure built around one ancestral line. When that name was forced onto families on the isolated tidal plantations, the community repurposed it. To the overseer, it was a property marker. To the community, it identified a clan that carried the elite agricultural knowledge of West Africa's rice coast, long before a plantation was ever built. If your people are Singletons, and your line traces back through the old coastal settlements of South Carolina, your name wasn't just handed to you, it was a title. Your ancestors carried the rice cultivation knowledge that built the wealth of an entire colony. Number 11. Smalls. Most people hear Smalls and think of a simple, unassuming English descriptive name. What the modern world leaves out is how fiercely independent the name actually became. In Gullah territory around Beaufort and the surrounding Sea Islands, the name Smalls stands as a monument to what the genetics confirm directly. Zimmerman and colleagues in the 2021 study used St. Helena Island Gullah participants specifically because that community represents the most genetically isolated and African ancestry concentrated population in their entire sample. The Smalls name clusters on St. Helena. Robert Smalls, the enslaved harbour pilot who hijacked a Confederate steamship, disguised himself as the captain and sailed his family to freedom past the rebel guns, was born on St. Helena Island. His documented ancestry traces to enslaved people brought through Bunce Island, the slave fort in Sierra Leone that supplied the Windward Coast stream. The maritime knowledge that made his escape possible, the canoeing, the tidal navigation, the intimate knowledge of the harbour was not coincidence. It was the inheritance of a West African coastal people. If your family is Smalls, the name in your mouth belonged to an unyielding people who looked at impossible odds, took the wheel, and steered themselves into destiny. Number 10. Pinckney. Pinckney looks like one of the most straightforward colonial names imaginable. High society Charleston, political signers of the Constitution, and for some, that is the surface story. But everything changed for me when I opened Lorenzo Dow Turner's historic 1949 study, Africanisms in the Gullah dialect. Turner identified over 4,000 African words surviving in Gullah, with the heaviest grammatical influence coming from Mende and Campbell of Sierra Leone. As I looked closer at how coastal communities actually pronounced and maintained names like Pinckney, I realised they were deliberately aligning the word with West African Campbell and Vi naming traditions. In those cultures, names were chosen based on circumstances of birth or spiritual resilience. When forced to adopt English surnames after emancipation, families chose to cluster under names that phonetically mirrored ancestral African words or preserved their tribal groupings. The Pinckneys of the Sea Islands formed tightly bound independent communities that fiercely guarded their distinct Gullah dialect against outside assimilation. A Pinckney might spend their whole life assuming their identity was merely inherited from a plantation owner, when the real story is one of linguistic rebellion, a clan that used a European word to keep their African soul alive in the isolated marshes. Number 9. Green. Green is one of the ultimate camouflage surnames of the coastal world, scattered across every island, creek and inlet from Georgetown down to Jacksonville, and it feels completely generic. But I dug into a 2015 ethnobotanical study that completely blew my mind. The research documented that Gullah root medicine uses at least 12 plant species whose medicinal applications are identical to documented Mende and Temne practices in Sierra Leone. Seeing those plant names side by side made me realise that green wasn't just a generic colour label. It was a beautifully coded marker for traditional West African herbal medicine. These were the root doctors, the midwives, and the herbalists who kept the community alive when white doctors refused to step foot on the malaria-plagued islands. From their isolated forest strongholds, green families became leaders in land preservation, holding on to ancestral properties through heirs, property laws for generations. If your family is green, the name in your bones is rooted in the deep, untamed sanctuary of the Low Country Islands. It is a badge of survival grown straight out of the earth. African Kingdom, the Mende and Temin of Sierra Leone. Number 8. Moultrie. Here is where the list starts reaching into names so distinct that people from outside the coastal south look twice at them. Moultrie. To modern ears outside the Carolinas it sounds unusual, but in the history of the Low Country frontier, it was a geographic and military marker of a cultural fortress. When I was researching the Stono Rebellion of 1739, I had to pause and sit with the pure strategic brilliance of the people who led it. As historian John Thornton documented, the uprising was organised by literate, military-trained soldiers from the Kingdom of Kongo. They knew how to wield weapons, they knew how to organise, and they possessed an unsparing drive for freedom that came from a warrior tradition that crossed the Atlantic intact. The Kongo and Angola regions supplied 40% of Charleston's total arrivals, the single largest source. Tracing the aftermath of that rebellion, I watched as these families intentionally scattered into the deep swamps to preserve their martial heritage. If your name is Moultrie, that word is the surname of brilliant strategists who refused to let their spirit be broken by a system of bondage. African Kingdom, the Kingdom of Kongo. Number 7. Rutledge. The Rutledge name carries one of the most transparent and yet deeply revealing stories in all of Gullah history, because it tells you exactly how your ancestors navigated a changing world to protect their own. On paper, a classic elite Anglo-Irish surname, but the genealogical evidence I gathered shows that during the chaotic transition from slavery to freedom, coastal families used this powerful name as brilliant political camouflage. The Rutledge family had been governors and chief justices of South Carolina. Carrying their name provided an immediate layer of legal protection in a dangerous post-war South. And when I looked at the genetic data from Micheletti and colleagues, the puzzle pieces clicked. The study found that the Senegambia region, the homeland of the Mandinka people, supplied 19.5% of Charleston's arrivals. Merchant Henry Lawrence wrote explicitly in colonial records that slaves from the River Gambia are preferred to all others with us, save the Gold Coast. The Mandinka were rice cultivators, sought by planters precisely for that skill, and they concentrated in the Cooper River rice belt, where the Rutledge plantation cluster sat. Underneath that high-status shield, the Rutledge Gullah communities maintained traditional West African council structures, praise houses, and communal farming practices. African Kingdom, the Mandinka of Senegambia, successors of the Mali Empire. Number 6. Campbell. Campbell is an iconic surname of the Gullah Geechee world and it comes attached to the most storied artistic tradition the Sea Islands ever possessed. The Campbell line is legendary for producing the master basket weavers of the Low Country. And this is not a vague cultural claim, it is a documented material culture transfer. Dale Rosengarten's 2003 study, Row Upon Row, Seagrass Baskets of the South Carolina Low Country, documented the direct connection between Gullah sweetgrass basket weaving and the identical coiling technique found in Wolof and Mende baskets of Senegambia today. The baskets were woven so tightly they could hold water. They were used to winnow rice on the plantations. They were an ancient technology, not a craft, carrying agricultural function and cultural memory across the Atlantic in the same object. Senegambia supplied 19.5% of Charleston's arrivals. The Wolof and Fulani were among the most specifically sought populations because of their rice knowledge. Behind the Campbell name sits a deeply documented lineage of elders, storytellers and griots who kept the Gullah language alive. African Kingdom, the Wolof Kingdom of Jolof, Senegambia. Number 5, Fraser. When I cross-referenced the Fraser maritime cluster in the Beaufort coastal waterways with the genetic data from Zimmerman and colleagues, the true history of this name became instantly clear. The Gullah profile shows only approximately 6% Nigerian ancestry, far below the 15% national African American average. Instead, the data aligns far more strongly with the windward coast stream from Sierra Leone, which at 16.3% of Charleston arrivals was the specific source of maritime and fishing communities. The Temne and Sherbro people of Sierra Leone's Atlantic coast were the region's premier and maritime specialists. Looking at the navigational history of the Low Country, I see the unmistakable thumbprint of their deep water fishing traditions, their boat building techniques using dugout canoes carved from single timber, and their intimate navigation of tidal waterways crossed the Atlantic and took root in the Low Country marshes under names like Fraser. The DNA says Sierra Leone, the ship records say Sierra Leone, African Kingdom, the Temne and Sherbro of Sierra Leone's Atlantic coast. Number 4, Ravenel. We are turning now to one of the most genetically distinctive clusters the Zimmerman study identified. The Ravenel plantations on the Cooper River were notorious for their extreme isolation, cut off from the mainland by vast rivers and dangerous swamps. Because of this isolation, the enslaved populations on these estates had very little contact with the outside world. When I mapped this geographic isolation against Lorenzo Dow Turner's linguistic data, the results were stunning. The most conservative Gullah dialect features, the ones with the deepest, most uncut African grammatical structures, survived in exactly these Ravenel settlements. I was awestruck to find that Turner recorded pure Mende syntactic structures, vocabulary and counting systems still being used here generations after the crossing. The Ravenels built an independent maritime network, navigating the dangerous coastal waters using West African techniques, operating as a self-sufficient community that the plantation system could not reach. African Kingdom, the Mende of Sierra Leone, windward coast. Number 3, Manigault. Manigault is one of the most powerful historic surnames of the southern frontier, but the true story of the Gullah Manigaults is a masterclass in encoded survival. I spent hours walking through the historic streets of Charleston, looking closely at the famous decorative wrought iron gates. Woven into the iron patterns are subtle abstract symbols, forms that art historian Robert Farris Thompson documented in his 1983 work Flash of the Spirit as West African Adinkra symbols and Kongo cosmograms. Standing there, it hit me. These were coded messages of strength and endurance beaten into metal, completely invisible to the planters who paid for them. The Kongo and Angola region, at 40% of Charleston's arrivals, included the Bakongo people, whose cosmogram, a circle divided by a cross representing the cycle of life and death, appears in Gullah grave decoration, quilt patterns and that ironwork. The Manigault clan used their elite craftsmanship to carve out a status of absolute necessity. When freedom came, the Manigault families were among the very first to systematically buy up plantation lands, establishing independent Gullah settlements that exist to this day. African Kingdom, the Kingdom of Kongo, Central Africa. Number 2, Deas. This carries one of the most precisely documented African connections of any Gullah surname in the historical record. The Deas name is concentrated in Beaufort County, St Helena Island, and the surrounding sea islands, and its African anchor is the Amistad. In 1839, a group of captives aboard the slave ship Amistad staged a revolt led by Senegambia. Those captives were Mende people from Sierra Leone. After their legal victory, American missionaries accompanied some of them back to Sierra Leone, where they documented the Mende language, culture, and naming traditions in detail. Historian Arthur Abraham's research established the direct cultural connection between the Amistad Mende and the Gullah Mende communities of the Sea Islands. The Deas name, clustering in the same geographic communities documented in the Zimmerman study, points to that Mende windward coast stream. When the gene map lights up Sierra Leone for a Deas family from St Helena Island, it is not pointing at a vague region. It is pointing at a people who sent their language, their kinship structures, and their resistance across the Atlantic and buried them in the surnames of the Sea Islands. African Kingdom, the Mende Kingdom, Sierra Leone. And here is number 1, the name nobody sees coming, Gullah, sometimes spelled Gala, Gola, or preserved in raw African retained surnames like Cujo, or those derived directly from the Mende language. To modern ears, it sounds like a general cultural label for the region, but the deeper truth that is far older and more precise than that. Historians and linguists have traced Gullah and Gala directly back to the Gola people of Liberia and Sierra Leone, a people who still exist there today. And in 2024, 23, and me added Gullah Geechee as a distinct genetic community in their ancestry composition reports, the only American population isolated enough to be genetically distinguishable from all other African Americans in the database. To carry the name Gullah, or a raw African name passed down through your family tree, means your ancestors achieved something the plantation system was specifically designed to prevent. They maintained their direct ethno-linguistic identity through the horrors of the slave trade, through the Civil War, and through centuries of forced assimilation. These families were the nucleus of the Sea Island resistance. They answered to no foreign identity in their private circles. They kept the syntax, the spiritual codes, and the proud names of their West African homeland intact. African Kingdom, the Gullah Kingdom, present-day Liberia and Sierra Leone, a people whose name you carry and whose descendants you can still find living in the country your ancestors left. So how many did you count? One name on its own means little, but a name from this list combined with the other signs, a DNA test that points to Sierra Leone, to Senegambia, to the Kongo and Angola region, family stories of an isolated island upbringing that never quite matched the history books, a grandmother's unique dialect that the standard dictionaries could not explain. That is when a name becomes a doorway. The plantation system tried to erase an entire people's identity. Over 40% of the enslaved Africans who built this country passed through one harbour. The transatlantic slave trade database records the ships. The Zimmerman study records the people. And for the first time in history, those two records can be matched surname by surname, kingdom by kingdom, genome by genome. The clan you were told about may not be the clan you came from. If you found these stories fascinating, subscribe and tell us in the comments. Is your name on this list? Your ancestors carried these names across an ocean. You only have to look at one to remember. Thanks for watching.